Frankly Speaking, here on WYDC TV Big Fox. Thank you so much for joining us. We're broadcasting live from the Hesselson studio. I'm your host, Frank Acom. We've got a lot to cover this morning. We'll also hear from Judy McKinney-Cherry. She's the executive director of Schuyler County Partnership. So that's coming up in just a little bit. Let's get right to it because we have so much to cover. There was that censorship hearing yesterday where, well, Democrats really went after Robert F. Kennedy Jr., so we'll talk a little bit about that, hopefully. Hunter Biden, of course, in the news, and that testimony yesterday from the whistleblowers. We'll talk about the media's coverage of that, reactions to what we learned. First, I talk about the media a lot here on the program, and I find this fascinating, and I think this is going to be a trend that you see, and it only leads to more trouble, more bias coming from the media. Google is going to test out AI tools to write news articles. Now, what they are suggesting in this piece, and we're not going to get too much in depth on this, but what they're suggesting is this is going to be an aid for journalists, a tool for them to use. I don't see how it's not just completely writing the articles that you end up seeing. Now, why do I say this is a problem? I don't know how AI works. I'm not some type of genius that can explain it perfectly to you. But for lack of a better word, use the term algorithms. So imagine if they base what they're writing on past articles, past quote-unquote journalism. Well, if we're already seeing a bias, does that bias only grow when you have, for instance, look at social media and the censorship that social media is involved in so often. Think about the articles that have been silenced on there. And then you think about the ones that have been encouraged or promoted. Obviously, there is going to be a built-in bias in this tool. So I just thought that was really interesting and something to keep in mind, that computers will soon be writing as if people didn't already have a lack of faith in many in the media. This should only encourage that even further. So let's talk about something of more importance. Take that off the screen. That is Biden and the bribery charge. This we're going to talk about in depth, but a bombshell FBI informant file describes a $10 million bribery allegation against President Biden and his son Hunter. And that was released yesterday by Senator Chuck Grassley. I always pronounce his name wrong. I always think it's Grassley, but I think it's Grassley. But anyway, you know who I mean. Showing that a Ukrainian oligarch claimed that he was coerced into making payoffs. We're going to take a look at some of the quotes. One of the big quotes there, as you see, Hunter is very often called stupid in the document. Zolsevsky made some comment that although Hunter Biden was stupid and that his dog was actually smarter, that he needed to keep Hunter Biden so everything would be okay. Now, I'm going to try my best this morning with the names that we're about to read and some of the quotes, but that's kind of the main idea. That's the overview of what we're talking about, at least at the beginning of the program here on Frankly Speaking. And I mentioned this because, and we'll get to the coverage in just a second, but there's obviously a bias overall in the coverage of this story. And we're going to get to that in depth because I want to show you how, much like they're attacking Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because they're concerned that he's around 20% in the polls, they're also downplaying what we're learning, and which is interesting because you talk about the plea deal with Hunter and you talk about all the allegations against former President Trump and how those have been handled by the media and by quote-unquote law enforcement. As compared to this story, which has right from the beginning been censored. And we learn now that Twitter actually knew the laptop was real when they still censored that breaking story from the New York Post. So, a couple of the quotes to take away from this piece. They hired Hunter Biden to protect us through his dad from all kinds of problems. That's one quote. Now, in late 2015 and early 2016, the informant met with Pozarski, a chief financial officer of Burisma, and that's a big name involved in this story, who bragged about having Hunter on the board, again, to use his father for protection. Then the informant met with this Zolchevsky, head of Burisma, Zlochevsky, I'm going to try, replied something to the effect of, quote, "Don't worry, Hunter will take care of all of those issues through his dad." The informant did not ask any further questions about what that specifically meant. Another piece, from Zelensky. It cost $5 million to pay one Biden and $5 million to another Biden. Again, these are some of the quotes in case you've missed them, because I don't believe the media is going to report on this. Zelensky made some comments that although Hunter Biden was stupid and his dog was smarter, Zelensky needed to keep Hunter Biden on board so everything would be okay, as I mentioned earlier. Zelensky stated that he didn't want to pay the Bidens, and he was pushed to pay them. He said he has many text messages and recordings, isn't that interesting, that show that he was coerced into making such payments. Now, they asked whether Hunter Biden or Joe Biden told Zelensky he should retain Hunter. The answer, according to this informant, was they both did. They both said you better retain Hunter. Zelensky said he had a total of 17 recordings involving the Bidens. 2 of the recordings, including Joe Biden, and the remaining 15 seconds only include Hunter Biden. The informant reiterated that per Zelensky, these recording evidence, Zelensky was somehow coerced into paying the Bidens to ensure Ukraine prosecutor General Viktor Shokin was fired. And remember, I don't want to get too much in the weeds with this. We just don't have the time. But Shokin was fired, and President Biden bragged about it. So these are some of the main takeaway. Let me give you the last two because we are running late already. Zelensky responded he did not send any funds directly to the quote-unquote big guy. That is the nickname or the reference to Joe Biden. That's what he was called. Zelensky responded it would take them, investigators that is, 10 years to find the recordings, i.e. illicit payments to Joe Biden. And finally, given the pervasive necessity to bribe government officials in Ukraine and Russia, the informant did not perceive Bozarsky or Zelensky's statements to be unusual, self-serving, or pretextual. So that's a quick overview. I know that's a lot to take in, but then we're going to, when we come back from break, quickly go through what some in the media are saying, some comments on this in general. We do have our guest, Judy McKinney-Cherry, coming up in just a moment, so stay with us. This is Frankly Speaking on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Okay, we are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. I'm your host, Frank Acom. We're broadcasting live from the Hesselson studio here on Market Street in Corning. We have a lot more to talk about with Hunter Biden, but I forgot to put my contact information up. If you'd like to weigh in on it, please feel free. Let's talk about the media. You heard some of the quotes, some of the maybe takeaway quotes, and I know it gets a little wonky because for many of you, if you watch the mainstream media, you perhaps have not heard anything about this. As I had mentioned, specifically with social media, the FBI told Twitter that Hunter Biden's laptop was real the day of the New York Post scoop, that big story from the New York Post, and they censored that post anyway. Again, the fix was in. It's very social media, very similar to what the mainstream media does as well, and that's why I mention it, because on NBC specifically, NBC's the show's called MTP Now. Not overly familiar with it, but NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitali trying to downplay what these whistleblowers are saying. And pretty soon you'll see attacks on the whistleblowers. It's a tried and true method that the media does. They'll question their validity. In this case, that's exactly what Vitali did. He called them, and here's the quote. Where is it exactly? Republicans are going to point to this continuously as a clear sign of wrongdoing or potential wrongdoing, and use it to continue to bolster these investigations that we saw them do earlier this week with IRS, and here we go, and you're going to hear this frequently, IRS so-called whistleblowers. Now, I thought we loved whistleblowers. It's interesting how the media sometimes loves whistleblowers, and then other times they're not big fans. So they're now so-called whistleblowers. So I don't know if that means that they're not. Is he suggesting they're not telling the truth? Is he suggesting that what they were saying was well known, so why even call them a whistleblower? I'm confused. But he's not the only one. Joe Scarborough using that term as well. So the so-called whistleblowers about Hunter Biden saying that he was given a lenient deal by the Department of Justice for his tax violations. This is yet another page of that as we watch the Senate and the House move forward on the House side, using the power of the gavel to continuously beat this drum against the White House and against his son, Hunter Biden. So again, that's coming from NBC, continuing with what Vitale had to say before we go to break. And frankly, in reading it, meaning that document that Grassley released, there are even some things that could be lost in translation between the Russian that was being spoken by this informant with the sources that he's referring to and the translation of that Russian. So it's not exactly a clear win or loss for anyone. So now, without any fact-based reason to say that, he's saying, there could actually be maybe just some lost in translations. Maybe that's what it is. Do you think, just ask yourself this before we go to break, do you think that benefit of the doubt from, how many years we heard about the Russian situation with Trump, Russia as he calls it, do you think that in that scenario, Vitale or anyone in the mainstream media would have come out and said, well, maybe something was lost in translation to try to discredit or downplay some of the very damning information coming from that release yesterday? More on this, but when we come back, Judy McKinney-Cherry, that's coming up next. So stay with us. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. I'm your host, Frank Acom, and this is the M.A. Neal Financial Services section of our program. And we're being joined by the Executive Director of Schuyler County Partnership. Judy, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you, Frank. It's great to be here.
We have a lot to talk about because the biggest thing we focus on this program is community. And I could not ask for somebody better to be on the program than you to talk about community. So tell us, you did not start here in our area, so tell us a little bit about your background.
Right. So I have a background. I actually came here from the state of Delaware, where I was both in the private sector and in the public sector.
Okay.
And but I would say that I grew up actually out west in Utah, where I went to college. Okay. And so I have a background actually in the environment.
Okay.
And so it's interesting that I'm in economic development, and it's it's pretty cool.
Does it translate?
It does translate.
Yeah.
Today it translates because now you don't do economic development without taking into account all of the ramifications to the environment. So it's a perfect translation.
That's a great point.
But my background in Delaware was I worked for a technology company for a number of years. Exited that company, sort of took an early retirement, at 42, and then worked for a governor as a commissioner. So in tourism and in economic development for 7 years.
Wow! So you've done everything.
No, there's still a lot to do.
Well, what did you think when you moved here? What are your observations maybe when you first got here, and what are your observations for our businesses today?
So it's interesting. I was, frankly, just really enamored and still am with the Finger Lakes region, with what Corning has to offer, with what Watkins Glen has to offer, and really sort of the culture that exists here is really a unique culture. In many ways, it's like a small state, and in other ways, it has the benefit of being in a big state.
Right.
So what I've noticed is that we have just a fabulous set of assets to work with, and that what we're probably not doing is maximizing those assets and thinking outside the box.
Sure.
We're very used to things working well for us, and I think we have the opportunity to really sort of amplify what has worked and really move us into a new direction for the future.
Well, then that's a great question then. So what are our biggest opportunities and what are our biggest challenges?
Well, I think we have some great opportunities around what's already been built. So, in the region, we have Cornell University, right? That is the sun, right? They are a huge economic benefit for the state and certainly for us. And so I think there's some opportunities for us to really leverage the research and the intellectual property that is coming out of Cornell, right? And how do we get that to be sort of planted in and around this whole community? So that's one. Another one would be just sort of taking all of the talent that exists within these corporations that we have, Heritage and Corning and Alstom. How do you take all of that intellectual property and then figure out how to spin out new companies?
Oh, interesting.
Right, so that you actually start to seed tomorrow's big businesses right here in our area.
Yeah. And that sounds like a difficult challenge, though, isn't it? How do you start that process?
Well, I think the first thing you do is you create an environment where it's okay to fail.
Oh,
You know,
sure.
Most
Yeah.
entrepreneurs, if
Right.
they're really good, they've
Yeah.
failed at least once.
Yeah.
So you create an environment that it's okay to fail,
Okay.
right? You just fail forward.
Yeah.
And
I
then
like
what
that.
you do is you make sure you have the assets. So you have your seed capital and your venture capital, and you have and angel investors, and then you have that ability to work with large companies and with small ones to incubate these startup companies. It can be done. It is done throughout the country. We just need to sort of focus those efforts here, and I think we could really, truly sort of create tomorrow and start by planting today.
Well, that's great. And also, I mentioned the challenges. You know, obviously, the economic climate in New York State is often criticized and questioned. Is that one of our biggest challenges?
Actually, it's not.
Oh, okay.
You know, the challenge that we have, and I'll just, I'll put it, any country, every country that was in World War II is suffering from a labor issue,
wow. Okay.
right? Labor and talent. And this is a global problem. So it's not a New York problem, it's not a US problem, it's global. And so I think that our biggest challenge that we have is really attracting and retaining excellent talent for all areas of our economy.
Okay.
So and we have to be thinking outside the box on what we're going to do with some of these positions
Sure.
that we just don't have the people, but they don't have them in other places either. That's one. The second problem that we have, or challenge, and I like to call it an opportunity, because the key is it's not so much, you can say it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity for us to really put a stake in the ground and do something special, right? And so the other one is, how do we take a look at what's happening in the demography today, right? What's happening with our millennials and our young workers? They're not buying homes
Right.
like
Right.
the Gen Xers did. Gen Xers bought homes because it was an investment.
Right.
The younger worker wants to travel. They don't want to put money. They don't want to fix up homes.
Right.
So we better figure out how we're going to work on housing, how we're going to attract these workers, how we're going to keep the ones we have, and how we're going to make it interesting and understand we have to meet them. We have to compromise and meet
Right.
them halfway. They are moving like every 3 or 4 years.
I know.
They're not staying put. So how do we keep them?
Right. And the days of younger people looking for a career that would last a lifetime, that's long gone.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, you look at resumes now, it's almost a badge of honor how many jobs you've had, right?
Well, I think what happens is you have to really look at those resumes, and I do hire and,
Right, of
and
course.
have hired and managed many teams in my career. And I think, again, I just use the word compromise. This is about being really clear with the expectations.
Sure.
And at the same time, someone moving into this area, they will stay if they have multiple places to work
Right.
where that skill set transfers.
Yeah.
It's when you only have 1 or 2 major employers where that skill set will transfer, they're less likely to move here because they really do have to physically move away.
right.
And so what we need to do is create a synergy and create, again, companies, small startups, other companies where if someone moves here, they know they can pick up and go, just like we would in a big city. I
Right.
can go to work for this company or that company or that company.
Well, and how much today, because you hear about this a lot in the news, the work from home culture because of COVID, how much can an area like ours really play to that? You stay here and you've got plenty of opportunities. You can work from home and it's an amazing area.
Right. So I do think that is an absolute strategy that needs to be employed. So that's I'll just tell you that that's
Yeah.
exactly one. But to have that, you need to make sure you've got bandwidth. You got to
Right.
make sure that you have
Oh,
all
great
the
point.
other assets that a young tech worker or someone who can work from home needs.
Right.
You know, you ask about opportunities, and if I don't bring this up, I am missing something big,
Sure.
which is Micron. Micron is
Oh,
a
yeah.
huge opportunity. So New York beat out Texas. Again, it is a huge opportunity if and only if all of our counties that are within, a couple hours of Syracuse really make a concerted effort to attract the supply chain.
Right.
So that's what makes it work. It's $100 billion. It's $100 billion project. It's
amazing.
50,000 jobs.
Yeah.
This is big. This is huge.
Yeah.
Again, we have all the assets between our IT and Corning and our community college system. The state has done what it needs to do. Now it's time for the rest of us to step up and do our part.
We have to take
which is
advantage, yeah.
take advantage
Yeah.
of it, right? This is a bluebird
Yeah.
for us. And so how do we make sure that all of the counties are participating and getting their sites ready, letting the state know what they have? And the first company to come in is a vacuum pump company. They are in Batavia.
Okay.
At the it's called the Stamp Facility. It's which again was started years ago, and now it's paying dividends.
Okay.
And it's a very large complex. It's the Science Technology Advanced Manufacturing Park.
I was going to say, there's always
That's it.
one. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
it. It's the park.
Yeah.
And so again, so this isn't like pie in the sky. This is real. This
Right.
can happen. But we need to have a really solid effort on the part of the Southern Tier, and especially this part of the Southern Tier, to really make that work. And I think that we have a great campus in Horseheads, Southern Tier Logistics, which I'm hopeful will get all their infrastructure in place.
Yes.
And really be able to play in this arena.
Do you find that some counties, not to name any specifically, are kind of short-sighted and only focus on our county? Because you mentioned that Micron is in Syracuse. That doesn't mean we can't take advantage of
Right,
that.
right. Well, economic development
Yeah.
For the last 20 years
Yeah.
has really been a regional program.
Right.
It's not a single county
Good,
program.
okay.
And I think that the single county aspect loses the fact that people travel, they commute, right,
Right.
for jobs. They don't stop at
Yeah.
the line and say, I can't go to work in this particular county, right?
Right.
So I do think that from a regional perspective, we do need to make sure that we are open and that we understand what I just said. I
Right.
mean, I am paid for out of Schuyler County
Right.
government. You
Sure.
know, that they pay 40% of my operations. But I have a great board who understands it's a regional play.
Right.
And so they're okay with me, because if I help bring in a large company, even if it's into Horseheads,
Of course.
my residents
Benefit. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
and my businesses, they
Everyone
benefit.
benefits.
Exactly. So it's really about, sort of looking forward and sort of walking away from the past, which was,
Yeah, kind of
it's
closed-minded
all about
or short.
mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it tough? Because your job almost sounds, because I'm going to ask you to do this in a moment, is to sort of predict the future in some ways. Is that fair to say?
That is part of what.
Yeah.
That is part of
Okay.
what. So I am a certified economic developer, which means you go through a series of tests and
Yeah.
and things. You have to demonstrate that you actually do think regionally, and that's one of the things you have to demonstrate. But it's interesting because part of what I try and do, and I'll just say this, in a previous life, I was a demographer
Okay.
for a state.
Yeah.
So, I've got this demographic
Right.
background. So part of what you have to do is try and figure out where is the puck going in the
Yeah.
in the terms of like hockey, right? Where is that puck going? And then how do we position so we're ready for it? And I think that that's probably the largest challenge is most elected officials and most residents are looking backwards.
Right.
They're looking at how it used to be and how great it used to be. And yet, when I ask them, well, would you give away your cell phone and go back
Right.
to,
Right. Yeah.
a landline?
Yeah.
Well, no. Well, would you give up your computer and go back to a typewriter?
Sure.
Well, no.
Right.
So we have to embrace the future. And then that's what opens up your ability to look forward. And so I think we do have some great, and I'll just say, everything that New York has that we see as a negative, like property taxes for businesses,
Right.
there is in most cases a remedy.
Okay. Interesting.
For small businesses or businesses in general that put a lot of capital into their building, there's a program called a 485B, and it gives them an abatement
Okay.
on their taxes.
You're right.
I mean, by law,
Right.
by New York law.
Right.
They just don't know it exists.
Well,
So
yeah.
now everybody's listening
Yeah, I
is
know.
going to run to
Google
their property
searching, yes.
assessment. Yeah, it's called 485B, and again, it's there's a remedy for many of these things in New York, and so I think New York has a lot going for it. The fact that the state is so, they're interested in upstate New York. This is huge.
Right.
In most states, the state government is just only interested in their largest cities or the largest city. So to have a state that has focused on the rural part and upstate New York, I think that has been a benefit. And so I look at the grant dollars. I look at things that are coming in. And I think that we have great players in economic development across the Southern Tier. We have some real talent. And I think that we're fortunate because we have some great companies as well that have supported a lot of these efforts. So we're pretty blessed.
Before we go, because I said you could predict the future, where do you see our area in the next 25, 30 years?
I think that we must be prepared for changes in many of our multinational corporations,
Okay.
right?
Right.
We have to be prepared for the fact that they will be much more focused on stock prices and making decisions that are based on stock prices.
Right.
You know, so I'm thinking, think about Alstom, right? That's a blessing to have them. 20 years from now, we better be working to keep them and make sure all of their research, if there's any research to be done, that we're doing it here.
Right.
I think it's a blessing that Corning does research here. We need to do everything we can to make sure that
Yes.
stays here. I think that there's an opportunity to spin out businesses that are not key,
Yeah.
and we need to be working on how do we incent that. And I think that we need to look at tourism and understand that that is fragile.
Yeah.
And so tourism is a big piece. We need
As
to
a-
be
yeah.
very, very careful of that, and again, really support the companies that are in that. And most importantly, honestly, it's how do we mine the talent, the effort, everything happening at Corning, at Cornell, and then how do we marry that up with our community colleges? And then how do we bring in population? So if I was predicting the future, I would say if we are able to spur small business development that's technology related, and we're able to attract population, because population drives everything, the rest will fall in place as it should.
Okay. Well, fingers crossed.
No, you don't cross your fingers.
No.
You work towards
You
it.
work towards it. Okay. Judy, thanks so much for doing this and giving us so much time this morning.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
All right. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV. Big Fox, stay with us. Thank you for joining us here on Frankly Speaking on WYDC TV. Big Fox, broadcasting live from the Hesselson's studio. Thank you to Judy McKinney-Cherry for being our guest. We're going to talk more about Hunter Biden. We've got a few things here about the presidential race. Before that, I just want to mention, and because I forgot to promote this on the show on Wednesday, we did have a program on yesterday if you missed it, but it was after the Women's World Cup. That's going to happen a few times towards the end of the month, and I will make sure to highlight for you when that's going to happen, because we are still going to have a live Frankly Speaking. It's just going to be as soon as the coverage of the Women's World Cup is over. So yesterday we went on around 8:15. We had a good show too if you missed it. Real good show. Okay, back to Hunter, and then we've got to take a short break. I got to play a little catch up because I ran long. My fault. I just enjoyed talking with Judy McKinney-Cherry. So we are going to talk more about Hunter when we come back. I want to mention this in case you missed it yesterday. Here we go. Road closure announcement. And remember, this is a community-minded program, and we'd like to bring these, well, in this case, an inconvenience to you, but of course, it's nobody's fault. This construction has to be done. Robert Dan Drive from Liberty Drive to Victory Highway will be closed due to railroad construction. There will be no access for vehicles or pedestrians from Victory Highway up to Sullivan Park. This is important because I know this is a very heavy traffic area. So Aureen Subdivision, Irwin Child and Family Center, HealthWorks, traffic will access that area via South Hamilton Street. So I want to make that quick announcement before we go to break. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV. Big Fox, a lot to cover. All right, we are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Let's get back into that discussion on the whistleblowers with the Hunter Biden case. Democrats are downplaying it, and those in the media doing the dirty work there too, downplaying anything the whistleblowers say. We mentioned earlier, called on NBC, so-called whistleblowers. House Democrat Whip Kathleen Clark actually arguing that the hearings are dangerous. And listen to the reasoning, and I want you to think, well, we'll get to that. She said, absolutely, listen, and this, of course, on Joe Scarborough's show. No surprise. Listen, the circus has come to town with the House GOP. And what's dangerous, this is dangerous having the hearing, about this is that the American people and their needs are not part of their agenda, and they want to focus on this political theater. Think about that statement coming from the party that, I don't know what other word you could use, but the political theater when it came to the Trump administration. Do you believe the American people's needs were on the agenda at that time, or was it everything about Russia or kind of what we're seeing now, but at that time Trump was in the White House with constant attacks, constant quote-unquote scandals manufactured very often by the media and people like this Democrat, Kathleen Clark. So again, it's dangerous to have these hearings. They even ask the questions are dangerous. I don't want to read the rest of her quote. It's similar. Yesterday we had Representative Goldman and his quotes on the program, which he's kind of reminds me a little bit of Adam Schiff, just a little bit in over his head. He little too smart by half. Thinks when he was asking those questions he had a real gotcha, and most of the time it ended up backfiring. This is what he had to say about it, because he's somewhat become the face of this conversation for the Democrat side. He said, and again, think about this, what he's saying here. Many of the steps they wanted to take, meaning the whistleblowers, to go after Hunter like they should, were very over-aggressive. And here we go. And did not take into consideration the fact that much of the conduct they were talking about was in an election year where the subject's father was on the ballot. So what is Representative Goldman saying there? Isn't he just saying to the world what we already known, that they had to keep these things quiet? They had to make sure that the laptop story from the New York Post was censored by social media because they had to make sure that they could get Biden across the finish line without all these scandals being put out there. Now, the media did a great job of keeping it quiet. The media made sure not to report on it, made sure to do the dirty work there. Jake Tapper, we had the quote a few days ago, maybe it was late last week, where he's saying we're going to report on Hunter. We've been great at reporting on Hunter. And then you go back to the quotes where he basically called it lying, called it disinformation. The term I mention a lot, disinformation. That's what the media uses so they don't have to report on something ever again. And actually, if you want to continue with this with Goldman, he claimed the censorship of the laptop story on social media actually helped more people see it. Now, hopefully we get a chance to talk about censorship later, but it doesn't look like we'll have much time. But yeah, Representative Daniel Goodman, I guess censorship is a great thing because more people actually heard about it and had to do the research to find out more. And there is no doubt that this article received far more attention because of the controversy than it would have ever been published without any controversy. So that neglects the fact that censorship, in many ways, discredited the legitimate report. So people said, no, we don't have to report on it. We don't have to talk about it because it was censored. It neglects the fact that censorship, first of all, not only wrong, in many minds, delegitimizes the story. As a matter of fact, if you remember, a December TIPP Insights polling survey revealed, quote, half of respondents said they would have voted differently had they known the Hunter Biden laptop revelations were authentic. That's what the Daily Mail reported at the time. But no, more people saw it because it was censored. Talk about a scary talking point from elected representatives. This, of course, coming from the Democrat side, arguing that censorship is a good thing. And you'll hear more about that if we get a chance to talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So the New York Post asked the question because they were in the forefront of this. They're the first ones to report on it. They were the ones that were censored on the laptop story. They were attempted to be discredited. So they have a lot to say about it. When we come back from this break, we will tell you, they asked a question. We'll tell you the answer. Who cares about Biden family corruption? Because yesterday we had Representative Dan Goldman's quote where he said, who cares? Who cares? Kind of like the Hillary Benghazi quote. What does it matter at this point? So who cares about Biden family corruption? We'll answer that question when we come back. Stay with us. This is Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox, broadcasting live from the Hesselson studio. I'm your host, Frank Acom. So the New York Post asked the question, who cares about Biden family corruption? The answer? America. That's who. Who cares if Hunter Biden and Gal Luft both got money from the same company? That's what Representative Dan Goldman blurted out on Wednesday after Representative Jim Comer noted in the Oversight Committee hearing on the Hunter case that both men were paid by the exact same company, the exact same entity, Chinese energy firm CEFC, a company, notably, that has ties to Chinese military intelligence. Now, can you ask for a better example of Democrat hypocrisy, they ask. We only care about shady payments for murky services when Republicans and their perceived allies got them. And they go through some examples, like why wouldn't we care about this? This is very troubling information. But they said maybe, and this is the New York Post editorial board, who again, their original reporting on this, the laptop specifically, was censored on social media. Maybe Democrats truly don't care about corruption by one of their own, but put tribal loyalties ahead of the country. That may be why they made use of so many hucksters, scammers, and crooks in their own efforts to take down Trump. You think of Michael Cohen, or you think of the Steele dossier, where they concocted 100% fake tales about the then president. They also relied on thieving lawyer Michael Avenatti, remember that name, who pressed absurd claims against Brett Kavanaugh. Goldman, and if you don't know his history, you'll understand in a moment. Goldman certainly seems well poised to poo-poo corruption among other Democrats, especially the Bidens. For starter, his vast family fortune rests on jeans, like blue jeans. This is Goldman. This is where he made his money on. Jeans that once proudly bore a made-by-white labor label. So he's no stranger to questionable income sources. That's the New York Post really doing a good job with the research there, but also calling Goldman to the carpet. Yet, some 50% of Americans think Hunter's getting special treatment from the feds. 55% say the government is not doing enough to investigate Joe Biden. 57% believe Biden took a $5 million bribe when he was vice president. In other words, Democrats, the Democrats may not care, but Americans do care. And that's why you give so much credit to the people that have been doggedly following this. And Republicans are now calling, before we go to our second to last break, Republicans' call to impeach Biden is now growing after the release of that FBI document yesterday. We had Jim Banks saying most corrupt family to ever live in the White House, impeach. Carrie Lake saying the president was guilty of extortion and treason in addition to bribery. So many comments on this. I don't know where this goes, but I'm glad that the investigation is continuing on. You will see it downplayed in the media, as we've reported all morning. You will also see, perhaps soon, the whistleblowers, the attempt to discredit them. So Miranda Devine, just before we go, said that the Joe Biden bribe allegations need a special counsel now. I think that's exactly what the FBI document proves. I think we've heard enough. It's time for a special counsel to look into all of this. Now, we have to take a short break, and then we're changing up the topic. So stay with us. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Thank you for watching Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. So there was a censorship hearing yesterday where Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was involved, and we know the media has been attacking him more and more, vicious name calling, because they don't like the fact that he's doing pretty good in the polls against President Biden. So specifically, Stacey Plaskett, Representative Plaskett, went after Robert F. Kennedy Jr. About some of the things he's posted in the past, and he finally had a chance to speak, and we're going to talk about that when I say finally in just a moment. He said the irony and the cognitive dissonance from the other side of the aisle, it's deafening. You could cut it with a knife. They're at the same time this is Massey leading into giving Kennedy time to speak. They're at the same time denying that censorship is occurring, but suggesting that there's more material that needs to be censored. Now, Kennedy said, what you have stated and tried to associate with me through guilt by association is simply inaccurate. Virtually everything. Every statement that you just made about me is inaccurate. I believe vaccines should be tested with the same rigor as other medicines and medications. You tried to associate me a moment ago with the replacement theory, which is racist. To say that I created a film that encourages blacks to not get adequate medical care is just completely abhorrent. Now imagine this. This is Democrats going after a Kennedy like this. And good for Kennedy for responding. That goes to show you how scared they are about Biden's chances. Kennedy then defined malinformation as requested by Representative Massey, explaining that it describes information that Facebook and Twitter and the other social media sites understood was true, but the White House and other federal agencies wanted to censor anyway for political reasons because it challenged their official orthodoxies. he said, I'll give you one example. I was included in a group, and Facebook and others were asked to censor us, which they did. Explaining that the people calling for the censorship, it was a very shady group, the Center for Digital Hate, that's funded by dark money, which he says should be looked into. A little bit more about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. before we wrap up, but we got to take a short break. Stay with us. This is Frankly Speaking on WYDC TV, Big Fox. We are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. So we're talking about that censorship hearing yesterday that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was a part of. And he finally said at one point, a government that can censor its critics has license to every atrocity. It is the beginning of totalitarianism. There's never been a time in history, this is a good point, there's never been a time in history when we look back and the guys who were censoring people were the good guys. And he quotes people, or he mentions people like that we used to read, like Orwell and Huxley and others. And he said, and they were all saying the same thing. Once you start censoring, you're on your way to dystopia and totalitarianism. Now, here's the ironic part of all of this. A hearing on censorship. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz, you remember that name, the head of the DNC at one point. Well, she was using an executive session. She tried to use an executive session, kind of a weird rule in this case, to end the public testimony. So what does that mean, boiled down? What that means is they love censorship so much, they do it at a censorship hearing. Democrats truly hate free speech, says the Post editorial board. So much so, in fact, that they actually tried to censor people at a hearing on censorship. You can't make it up. On Thursday, Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida sought to use a technical House rule to stop RFK Jr.'s testimony on the ground that he had made earlier, quote, despicable statements. And he has. I mean, there's some pretty rough things that he said. Don't get me wrong. But think about what she's saying. Despicable things. So it's okay to censor him at the hearing on censorship. So now you're being judged by everything you've ever said in the past, and now you don't have a quote-unquote platform. There's that word that they would use. But of course, the First Amendment is specifically meant to protect despicable speech. It's not needed for remarks no one objects to. That includes offensive, scientifically illiterate, and tinfoil hat-ready speech. So they're obviously not fans of RFK Jr. Wasserman Schultz's attempt to shut down RFK Jr. on a technicality lines up nicely with the blistering hostility her party has shown in recent years towards protected speech. Yes, we even see the White House attempting to censor on social media. We could have so many examples. As does Delegate Stacey Plaskett, who I mentioned earlier, and she tried to slash Kennedy's speaking time, not give him enough time to speak. Plaskett earlier this year threatened journalist Matt Taibbi with jail over his own congressional testimony on, you guessed it, government efforts to censor Twitter. So we can go on and on. It says here, and funny how the party that sounds the democracy is dying. You know, they say that so often. They said it so often under Trump or when he's running for re-election. Democracy is dying. They say it every 5 minutes, but yet they act so brutally against bedrock principles of democracy. Lifelong Democrat RFK Jr., a Kennedy, said at the hearing, censorship is antithetical to our party. Not anymore, it's not. It's embraced. We are out of time. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Thank you to Judy McKinney-Cherry for being our guest, the Executive Director of Schuyler County Partnership. Appreciate that. We've got a great lineup next week, so make sure you tune in starting at 7 a.m., on Monday for Frankly Speaking, right here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. I've been your host, Frank Acom. Have a great weekend, and we will talk to you bright and early Monday morning. I look forward to it already.